Have you ever wondered what you would do if you lost everything? Your home, your marriage, your future, and the only place you could afford was an abandoned mansion everyone believed was cursed. Most people would have walked away. Grace Holloway walked in. She thought she was buying nothing more than a crumbling old house hidden at the edge of a forgotten forest. Instead, she unlocked a hidden family secret that had been buried for nearly a century. A secret powerful enough to change not only her own life, but the lives of countless others. But here's the part no one saw coming. The mansion wasn't waiting for treasure hunters. It was waiting for her. And before this story is over, you'll discover why one broken woman, one forgotten house, and one tiny hidden key became the beginning of the most extraordinary second chance either of them could have imagined. I promise you, if you leave before the end, you'll miss the moment that transformed heartbreak into hope and revealed that sometimes the place everyone fears the most becomes the place where miracles quietly begin. So take a deep breath, because this isn't just another mystery story. It's an inspirational story about courage, forgiveness, hidden truths, and the incredible power of starting over when the whole world believes you're finished. Sometimes, the hardest moment in a person's life doesn't arrive with shouting or chaos. Sometimes, it begins with a single decision that everyone else believes is a terrible mistake. Grace Holloway hadn't been called courageous in a very long time. Not on the day her husband walked away, leaving her for someone almost half her age. Not when the bank placed foreclosure papers on the front door of the house where she'd imagined raising her family. And certainly not now. 38 years old, 7 months pregnant, alone, with nothing left except the final check from a painful divorce. Most people would have rented a small apartment. Some would have moved in with relatives. Grace did something no one could understand. She bought a mansion that everyone in town believed should have been left alone forever. People whispered about Blackwood Manor long before Grace ever heard its name. An enormous estate hidden beyond miles of forest, where rusted gates stood frozen in place and ivy swallowed stone walls one season after another. Years ago, it belonged to Victor Blackwood, a wealthy businessman whose name was surrounded by stories no one could ever prove. Hidden rooms, missing fortunes, people who entered the house and were never spoken of again. Whether those stories were true didn't matter anymore, because fear had already turned the mansion into something larger than a building. It had become a legend. For decades, no one dared to buy it. No one dared to live there. No one even stayed long enough to ask whether the stories were true. Grace did something different. She found the property listed in a government auction. She bought it without seeing it. Friends begged her not to sign the papers. Neighbors said she had lost her mind. Even the real estate agent looked relieved when she handed over the keys. But when your old life has already fallen apart, walking into a place everyone else fears doesn't seem nearly as frightening. Late that afternoon, Grace stood before the weathered iron gates. The wind carried the scent of rain through the towering trees. The mansion rose silently beyond them, its broken windows staring into the fading sky like eyes that had spent decades waiting for someone to return. She rested one hand on the child growing beneath her heart. The other tightened around the cold brass key. For a long moment, she simply stood there, not because she was afraid, but because something deep inside her told her this place wasn't just another abandoned house. It was waiting for someone willing to uncover everything it had kept hidden for generations. Grace slowly unlocked the front door. The old hinges groaned as if waking from a very long sleep. Dust drifted through the fading sunlight. The silence inside felt almost alive. She took one careful step across the threshold and whispered softly to the little girl she hadn't even met yet. "Every house keeps its secrets. Maybe this one has been waiting for us." Grace believed she had come here searching for a place to rebuild her life. She couldn't have known that before the first night was over, She would uncover the first piece of a truth buried for generations. And once that truth found her, there would be no turning back. The first night inside Blackwood Manor was colder than Grace had imagined. The silence was different, too. Not empty, not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that makes you aware of every heartbeat, every breath, every tiny sound your mind wishes it hadn't heard. The old radiators rattled somewhere inside the walls before falling silent again. Whatever warmth they had once provided had disappeared years ago. Grace gathered a few pieces of firewood she had bought on the drive into town and carefully arranged them inside the enormous stone fireplace in the grand living room. The first match burned her fingers. The second went out almost immediately. The third finally caught. Within minutes, orange flames danced across the dry pine logs, filling the room with soft, crackling sounds that somehow made the giant mansion feel just a little less lonely. She lowered herself carefully onto an old woven rug, wrapping both hands around a steaming mug of chamomile tea. Her free hand rested instinctively on her belly. The baby kicked gently. Grace smiled. "I know," she whispered. "This place is a little scary." Another kick. "I promise, I'm trying." For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this broken house could become the beginning of a different life. Outside, rain tapped softly against the tall windows. Inside, the fire painted warm shadows across faded portraits and peeling wallpaper. Everything smelled of damp wood, old books, and a faint trace of whiskey that seemed impossible after so many years. Grace leaned back against the sofa and closed her eyes for only a moment. Then she heard it. A dull, heavy thud. Her eyes opened instantly. She didn't move. The sound came again. Not the groaning of old timber, not branches scratching against the roof. This was slower. Deliberate! As though something heavy had fallen onto a wooden floor, then been dragged several feet. Her heartbeat quickened. The baby shifted again. Grace forced herself to laugh, though the sound barely resembled one. "Probably a raccoon," she whispered into the empty room. A pause. "Or maybe a family of squirrels." Another pause. "On tunper and mump on onburum." Or an old ghost who's too tired to haunt anyone properly. Her own joke failed to comfort her. The sound came a third time, this time from somewhere directly above her. She slowly stood. Every instinct told her to stay beside the fire until morning. But another voice, one she hadn't listened to in years, quietly reminded her that fear had already stolen enough from her life. She reached for the flashlight on her phone. Its pale beam barely pushed back the darkness. Step by step, she climbed the sweeping staircase. Each wooden stair answered with a long, aching creak beneath her weight. The second floor felt even colder. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, lined with faded wallpaper that curled away from the walls like pages from an ancient book. The sound had stopped. Only silence remained. Grace followed the corridor toward the east wing, where one door stood slightly open. She didn't remember leaving it that way. She pushed it gently. The hinges sighed. Inside was an elegant bedroom frozen in another lifetime. Dust covered the vanity. A velvet chair sat beside an empty fireplace. Moonlight slipped through cracked curtains, covering everything in silver. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Nothing should have frightened her. Yet something felt wrong. Her eyes settled on a massive oak wardrobe standing against the far wall. One of its doors hung open only a few inches. Inside, an old white sheet had slipped from the upper shelf and lay crumpled across the floor. It looked almost as though someone had searched through it only moments before. Grace swallowed. "No one else is here," she whispered. The words sounded far less convincing once they left her lips. She searched the room carefully. Under the bed, inside the wardrobe, behind the curtains. Nothing. No animals. No intruders. No explanation. She left the bedroom with the door fully open behind her. Back downstairs, she checked every lock twice. Then 3 times. She sat awake beside the fireplace until the last ember faded into ash. Morning arrived quietly. Golden sunlight poured through windows that hadn't welcomed daylight in decades. The fear of the night suddenly felt almost foolish. Determined not to let old stories control her, Grace spent the day exploring every room in the mansion. One by one, she opened shutters, pulled away cobwebs, let fresh air drift through forgotten hallways. The estate was far larger than she had realized. 3 floors, an attic, a sprawling basement, and beyond the back doors, a glass greenhouse, long surrendered to vines and wildflowers. The house wasn't ugly. It was wounded. Like someone had loved it once, then simply walked away. Late that afternoon, while dusting an old bookshelf in the library, Grace discovered a framed photograph tucked behind a stack of forgotten ledgers. A sharply dressed man stood confidently beside the mansion's front entrance, a cigar between his fingers. On the back, someone had written in fading ink, "Victor Blackwood, Autumn 1934, before everything changed." Grace stared at those final 4 words. Before everything changed? She couldn't explain why, but something deep inside her whispered that those words weren't describing Victor Blackwood. They were warning her. Grace couldn't stop thinking about the words written behind the old photograph. Before everything changed. She slipped the picture carefully into her jacket pocket before continuing through the mansion. Somehow, those 4 words stayed with her all afternoon, echoing in her mind long after she had forgotten every other detail of the room. Outside, the sky slowly darkened beneath thick autumn clouds. Inside, Blackwood Manor seemed quieter than ever. Almost too quiet. That evening, after a simple dinner of canned soup and toasted bread, Grace found herself climbing the staircase again. She told herself she only wanted to prove there was nothing to fear. Nothing more. The east wing looked exactly as she had left it. The bedroom door still stood open. Moonlight spilled across the faded wooden floor. Everything appeared perfectly still. Then she noticed something. The wardrobe door was closed. Grace stopped walking. She was certain she had left it wide open the night before. She remembered doing it on purpose. A strange chill crept slowly across her shoulders. "It probably swung shut," she whispered. Old houses shifted. Wood expanded. Doors moved. There had to be a reasonable explanation. She walked into the room. Slowly, carefully. The silence felt heavier now. She reached for the wardrobe handle. The old brass knob felt ice cold beneath her fingers. With one steady pull, the door opened. The white sheet was still inside. The empty shelves remained untouched. Nothing had changed. Grace released a nervous laugh. "I really am letting this place get into my head." She turned toward the doorway. Then something caught the corner of her eye. On the wall beside the wardrobe, a thin shadow. Perfectly straight. Far too straight to be natural. She stepped closer, running her fingertips across the faded wallpaper. She felt it almost immediately. A narrow seam, about 7 feet tall, hidden beneath layers of cracked paint and wallpaper that had yellowed with age. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't part of the wall. It was a door. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure no one would ever notice it. Grace pressed her ear against the wood. Silence. Then, a faint current of cold air brushed against her cheek. Her heart skipped. There was empty space behind it. Without thinking, she hurried downstairs. The kitchen drawers offered little more than rusted utensils, but eventually she found an old utility knife. Back upstairs, She carefully slid the blade beneath the wallpaper. The brittle paper peeled away in long, delicate strips, layer after layer, until aged oak boards finally appeared beneath decades of forgotten paint. Then she saw it, a tiny iron keyhole, hidden almost perfectly within the wood grain. Grace stared at it in disbelief. The stories were true. Maybe not the ghosts, maybe not the curses, but someone had hidden something here, something important enough to disappear forever. She searched every drawer in the bedroom, every cabinet, every shelf. Nothing. No key. No clue. Only questions. That night she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined someone standing on the other side of that hidden door. Waiting. Morning couldn't come fast enough. Determined to keep searching, Grace spent the next 2 days clearing room after room. Old trunks, broken desks, collapsed bookshelves. Most contained nothing but dust and forgotten memories, until she reached the mansion's library. High above the fireplace stood a row of leather-bound novels, their covers faded almost beyond recognition. One book looked strangely newer than the others. She pulled it free. Its title had nearly disappeared beneath time. The Silent River. As she opened it, something heavy dropped into her hand. A key. Solid brass. Beautifully crafted. Its bow was shaped like an oak leaf, every vein carved by hand. Grace's breath caught. It couldn't be coincidence. She hurried upstairs, her heartbeat growing louder with every step. The key slid into the hidden lock, as though it had been waiting there all these years. For one terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, click, the sound echoed through the silent hallway. The hidden door slowly drifted inward with a long, aching groan. A breath of cold air rolled out from the darkness beyond. Older than the house, colder than the autumn wind outside. Grace lifted her flashlight. Narrow stone steps disappeared into the darkness below. She hesitated. Every instinct told her to close the door. Walk away. Pretend she had never found it. But another feeling, stronger than fear, pulled her forward. One careful step. Then another. The staircase spiraled downward beneath the mansion until the sounds of the outside world disappeared completely. At the bottom waited a room untouched for nearly a century. Wood-paneled walls, a long oak table covered in dust, shelves lined with leather ledgers, crystal decanters still resting behind an old mahogany bar. Time itself seemed to have stopped. Then her flashlight settled on something built into the far wall, a massive steel safe. Its black iron surface was scarred by age, yet it remained firmly sealed. Beside it lay a filing cabinet overturned across the stone floor. Yellowed documents had spilled everywhere. Grace knelt carefully and gathered the first folder she could reach. The paper crackled softly in her hands. Across the front, typed in fading black ink, were 3 words that stole the breath from her lungs. Holloway family. Grace froze. Her last name. Inside a room no one had entered for decades. Inside a mansion she had only purchased days ago. At that moment, she realized something that made every story she'd ever heard seem insignificant. She hadn't simply bought an abandoned mansion. Somehow, the mansion had been waiting for her. Grace remained motionless, the folder still trembling in her hands. For several long moments, she couldn't bring herself to open it. The silence inside the hidden room felt almost sacred now, as though the walls themselves had been guarding this secret for generations. Her heartbeat echoed through the underground chamber. Slow, heavy, uncertain. Finally, she took a slow breath and lifted the cover. Inside were dozens of yellowed documents, carefully organized despite the passing decades. Birth certificates, property deeds, handwritten letters tied together with faded ribbon. black and white photographs whose edges had curled with age. She picked up the first photograph. A young woman stood beside the front steps of Blackwood Manor, smiling gently as she held a baby wrapped in a white blanket. The expression in her eyes stopped Grace cold. It wasn't happiness. It was hope mixed with fear. The kind of look only someone protecting the people they loved could understand. Grace gently brushed the dust away from the back of the photograph. In faded handwriting were the words, "For the child who deserves a future untouched by our past." She read the sentence twice. Then a third time, something deep inside her shifted. Until now, she had believed this mansion represented everything she had lost. Her failed marriage, her loneliness, her desperation. Foy, a reckless purchase made by a frightened woman with nowhere else to go. But sitting in that hidden room, surrounded by the lives of people long gone, she suddenly realized something she had never considered before. Every family carries stories that never make it into photo albums. Every generation hides pain it hopes the next one will never have to inherit. Perhaps the people who lived here weren't remembered because of the wealth they built. Perhaps they were remembered because of everything they sacrificed trying to protect those they loved. Grace rested both hands on her belly. Her daughter stirred softly beneath her sweater. Tears filled her eyes. "I'm beginning to understand," she whispered. "I'm not here by accident." She continued reading. Most of the papers detailed land purchases and financial records, but scattered among them were personal letters. One, written by Victor Blackwood himself, caught her attention. The ink had faded, but every word remained clear. If one day this house belongs to someone who still believes kindness is stronger than fear, then perhaps everything we endured will finally have meaning. Grace lowered the letter. For years she had blamed herself for everything that had gone wrong. She believed she had failed as a wife, failed at protecting her family, failed at building the life she had promised her unborn daughter. But those words quietly unraveled the burden she had carried for so long. Life wasn't asking her to erase her past. It was asking her to build something better because of it. She looked around the forgotten chamber once more. The safe, the ledgers, the photographs, the hidden staircase. None of them felt frightening anymore. Instead, they felt like pieces of an unfinished story waiting for someone brave enough to finish it. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood Manor, Grace smiled. Not because the mysteries had disappeared, but because her fear had. When she climbed the staircase back into the mansion, the morning sunlight was pouring through the tall windows, filling the hallway with warm, golden light. Everything looked different. The peeling wallpaper, the cracked wooden floors, even the old portraits watching silently from the walls. Nothing had changed. Yet somehow, everything had. She slowly walked from room to room, no longer seeing a decaying mansion abandoned by time. She saw possibilities. She imagined children's laughter echoing through the long hallways, fresh flowers resting beneath the windows, families gathered around the enormous fireplace, rooms once filled with silence becoming places where people could begin again. For the first time in many years, Grace stopped asking, "Why did this happen to me?" Instead, a different question quietly formed inside her heart. What can I build from everything I've survived? As she stood beside the front window overlooking the rusted gates, the wind carried fallen leaves across the long driveway. The mansion no longer felt like a prison built from forgotten memories. It felt like a promise. A second chance neither she nor the house had believed they deserved. Grace gently rested one hand over her heart and the other over her unborn daughter. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "I don't know how yet, but I finally believe we will." Far away, somewhere beyond the trees, thunder rolled softly across the hills. Grace didn't know that new dangers were already moving toward Blackwood Manor. She didn't know someone else had spent years searching for the very room she had just uncovered. She only knew one thing. The frightened woman who had unlocked the front door a few days earlier was no longer the same woman standing there now. And sometimes, the greatest treasure hidden inside an old house isn't what waits behind a locked door. It's the person you become after finding the courage to open it. Grace stood in the middle of the grand foyer long after the morning sun had climbed above the trees. For the first time since buying Blackwood Manor, she no longer saw a house everyone feared. She saw a story that had never been finished. The folder rested against her chest as though it carried a heartbeat of its own. Every photograph, every handwritten letter, every faded document whispered the same truth. Someone had fought desperately to protect this family's future. Now, somehow, that responsibility had found its way to her. She walked slowly back into the hidden room beneath the east wing, carrying a notebook, a flashlight, and a quiet determination she hadn't felt in years. This time, she wasn't there to satisfy her curiosity. She was there to understand. For hours, she read through old ledgers, journals, and carefully folded letters. Most described land purchases, business partnerships, and financial records from nearly a century earlier. But scattered among them were personal notes, small pieces of humanity hidden between pages of numbers. Victor Blackwood wasn't the ruthless man the town's stories had created. At least, not entirely. He was cautious, protective, always preparing for the day everything might disappear. One sentence, scribbled hurriedly across the margin of an old leather journal, stopped Grace completely. If they ever force us to leave, follow the river. The truth was never buried beneath this house. She read it again, then again. Follow the river. Those 4 words refused to leave her mind. The next morning, before sunrise painted the hills gold, Grace packed a backpack with water, a flashlight, and the old journal. She followed a narrow trail behind the mansion that disappeared into the forest. The autumn air was crisp. Leaves crunched beneath her boots. Birdsong drifted softly through the towering oaks. Nearly an hour later, she heard it. Running water. A narrow river curved gently through the valley behind Blackwood Manor, just as the journal described. Grace walked slowly along the bank, scanning every tree and every stone. At first, nothing. Only moss-covered rocks and fallen branches. She almost convinced herself the journal had been nothing more than an old man's confused memories. Then sunlight caught something unusual. Carved into the trunk of a massive oak tree was a symbol, a single blackwood leaf. Exactly the same design engraved on the brass key she had found hidden inside the library. Her pulse quickened. She looked around carefully. Directly beneath the tree stood a circle of large stones, too perfectly arranged to be natural. Grace knelt and began pulling away years of damp leaves and tangled roots. Within minutes, her fingers struck metal. She brushed away the dirt. An old iron hatch slowly emerged from the earth. Her hands trembled. The brass key slid into the lock effortlessly. With a deep metallic click, the hatch released. A rush of cool air escaped from below. She hesitated only for a second before climbing down the narrow ladder. At the bottom waited another underground chamber, smaller than the room beneath the mansion. Cleaner. Dry. Metal shelves lined every wall. Wooden crates stood stacked with remarkable precision, untouched by moisture or time. Grace opened the nearest crate. Inside were dozens of leather folders sealed with black wax. Land deeds, ownership records, letters signed by judges, governors, and businessmen whose names still appeared in local history books. These weren't ordinary family keepsakes. They were proof that powerful people had spent generations rewriting the truth. She opened another crate. Bundles of cash wrapped in oilcloth. Gold coins, bearer bonds, jewelry carefully packed inside velvet boxes. Enough wealth to change dozens of lives. Enough temptation to destroy one. Grace stared silently. Only months earlier, she had been wondering how she would afford diapers. Now she was kneeling beside a fortune beyond anything she had ever imagined. Yet, it wasn't the money that brought tears to her eyes. It was the final box resting alone on the highest shelf. Inside lay a small knitted baby blanket, yellowed with age, folded with extraordinary care. Beneath it rested a handwritten letter. The paper cracked softly as Grace unfolded it. If you're reading this, then our family survived. Perhaps not with our name, perhaps not with our fortune, but if kindness still lives inside the person holding this letter, then we protected the only treasure that truly mattered. Grace could no longer hold back the tears. She pressed the blanket gently against her heart. Her daughter moved beneath her coat, almost as though she understood. At that moment, Grace realized something that changed everything. The hidden fortune was never meant to make someone rich. It had been preserved to give someone a chance to begin again, not only for themselves, but for others who believed life had already left them behind. When Grace climbed back into the afternoon sunlight, the world looked different. The river sparkled beneath the autumn sky. The wind carried golden leaves across the water. Blackwood Manor stood quietly in the distance, no longer looking abandoned. It looked patient, as though it had spent decades waiting for exactly this moment. Grace looked toward the old mansion and smiled through her tears. "I understand now," she whispered softly. "You weren't protecting money. You were protecting hope." And for the first time since her entire life had fallen apart, Grace no longer wondered whether she could rebuild her future. Instead, she began wondering how many other broken lives she could help rebuild beside her own. Grace didn't sleep that night. Not because she was afraid anymore, but because her heart refused to quiet down. The knitted baby blanket lay folded beside her on the old oak table, while the letter rested open beneath the glow of a single lamp. Outside, the wind swept through the towering trees surrounding Blackwood Manor, carrying the sound of rustling leaves against the weathered windows. Only a week earlier, that sound would have terrified her. Now, it sounded almost like someone whispering. "Keep going." She looked around the enormous mansion. The cracked ceilings, the peeling wallpaper, the empty hallways. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. This house no longer felt like a place she had bought. It felt like a responsibility, a promise left unfinished by people she had never met. Grace gently rested both hands on her belly. Her daughter answered with a soft kick. "I think I know what we're supposed to do," she whispered with a smile. The next morning began before sunrise. Instead of searching for more hidden rooms or forgotten fortunes, Grace picked up a broom, then a bucket, then a hammer. One room at a time, one window at a time, one broken floorboard at a time, the mansion slowly began breathing again. Dust disappeared beneath warm wooden floors. Curtains were pulled open after decades of darkness. Sunlight returned to rooms that had almost forgotten what morning looked like. Neighbors driving past noticed smoke rising from the chimney for the first time in years. Some slowed their cars. Others simply stared. The old mansion no longer looked abandoned. Someone had come home. A few days later, an elderly carpenter named Walter Brooks stopped at the front gate. He removed his cap before speaking. "I worked here when I was 17, he said quietly. Grace looked surprised. "You did?" Walter nodded toward the porch. "My father repaired these steps almost 50 years ago." His eyes drifted across the mansion. "I never thought I'd see anyone trying to save this place." Grace smiled softly. "I'm trying to save more than the house." Walter looked at her for a long moment. Then, without another word, he opened the back of his pickup truck. It was filled with lumber. I've got enough wood left over from another job. He shrugged. Seems like this old place needs it more than I do. Grace tried to offer payment. Walter simply smiled. Some debts aren't paid with money. By the end of the week, others began arriving. A retired electrician, a widow who loved gardening, a young painter struggling to keep his business alive. No one came because they believed the legends anymore. They came because they believed in Grace. Little by little, the forgotten mansion became a place where strangers worked side by side without expecting anything in return. Grace often caught herself standing quietly in the hallway, watching people laugh while carrying paint cans or repairing broken windows. She hadn't heard laughter inside these walls before. It changed everything. Then, one rainy afternoon, everything changed again. Grace was organizing the documents inside the hidden room when she heard tires crunching across the gravel driveway. She climbed upstairs and looked through the front window. A black SUV had stopped outside the gate. Her smile disappeared. Two men stepped out. Dark suits, dark coats. Neither looked toward the mansion. Instead, they studied it. Carefully, patiently, as though confirming something. Grace's heartbeat quickened. Neither man knocked. Neither called out. They simply walked slowly around the property, taking photographs. One stopped beside the greenhouse. The other examined the old river trail leading into the forest. Almost 20 minutes later, they returned to the vehicle. Before leaving, one of them walked back to the mailbox and quietly slipped a plain white envelope inside. Then they disappeared down the long gravel road. Grace waited. 5 minutes. 10. Only when she was certain they were gone did she walk outside. Inside the envelope was no letter. Only one photograph. Her hands began trembling. It was a picture of her, taken 3 days earlier, standing beside the underground hatch near the river, holding the knitted blanket. Someone had been watching her, long before she realized she wasn't alone. Taped to the back of the photograph was a single sentence. Some secrets survive because people know when to leave them buried. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. She looked toward the forest. Nothing moved. Only trees. Only wind. But suddenly, the silence no longer felt peaceful. Someone knew about the hidden chamber. Someone knew she had found it. That evening, Grace locked every door, closed every curtain. She placed the old journal, the letters, and the baby blanket inside a wooden chest beneath her bed. Then she sat beside the fireplace until long after midnight. Fear tried to return. It whispered all the familiar lies. Leave. Sell the house. Run while you still can. Months ago, she would have listened. Months ago, she had spent every day believing she wasn't strong enough, that she had lost too much. That life had already defeated her. But something inside her had changed. She looked at the dancing flames, then down at the little life growing beneath her heart. No, she whispered firmly. I'm done running. They took enough from me already. They don't get to take this. For the first time since her marriage collapsed, Grace wasn't fighting for a house. She wasn't fighting for hidden treasure. She wasn't even fighting for the truth buried beneath Blackwood Manor. She was fighting for the future. For the little girl who would one day ask where courage comes from. Grace finally knew the answer. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the moment a broken heart decides. It is something worth protecting. Outside, thunder rolled across the distant hills. Far beyond the iron gates, unseen headlights appeared once more on the dark country road. This time, they didn't drive away. They turned slowly toward Blackwood Manor. And Grace had no idea. The greatest battle of her life had just begun. The headlights moved slowly through the iron gates. Grace stood beside the front window, one hand pressed against the curtain and the other resting over her unborn daughter. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. For one terrible moment, Every fear she had fought to silence came rushing back. The black SUV stopped in front of the mansion. Two men stepped out. The same dark coats. The same cold, measured movements. But this time, they weren't alone. A second car pulled in behind them. Then a third. Grace froze. More doors opened. More figures stepped into the rain. She could no longer tell who had come to threaten her. And who had come to help. The first knock echoed through Blackwood Manor like a warning. Grace didn't move. Then came another. Slow. Firm. Certain. She looked toward the staircase. Toward the hidden room. Toward the old letters and photographs that had survived nearly a century in darkness. All of it had led to this moment. She thought of the woman in the photograph holding a baby against her chest. She thought of the letter hidden beside the forgotten blanket. She thought of the words that had changed her life. If kindness still lives inside the person holding this letter, then we protected the only treasure that truly mattered. Grace took a breath. Then she opened the door. Rain swept across the porch. The two men in dark coats stood before her. Behind them were Walter Brooks, the retired electrician, the young painter, several neighbors from town, and a woman Grace recognized immediately, Jillian Hayes. A local attorney who had helped several families fight wrongful property seizures. Jillian stepped forward. Grace, she said gently, we need to talk. One of the men reached inside his coat. Grace tensed. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a leather identification case. State investigators, he said. We've been tracking an illegal land acquisition network connected to this estate for years. Grace stared at him. The second man held up the photograph that had been left in her mailbox. We didn't send this. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Then who did? Jillian looked toward the road. People who believed the Blackwood property still contained documents that could expose them. Grace glanced back into the mansion. The ledgers. The deeds. The signed agreements. Everything she had found beneath the house. It wasn't only a family history. It was evidence. The man continued. Some of the names in those records belonged to people who spent decades stealing land, hiding assets, and silencing anyone who got too close. Grace wrapped one arm protectively around her belly. Are they coming back? Not tonight, Jillian said. She turned toward the line of vehicles behind her. We made sure they couldn't. Only then did Grace notice the sheriff's car parked near the gate. Blue lights reflected faintly against the rain-soaked trees. The danger wasn't gone forever. But for the first time, Grace wasn't facing it alone. She stepped back and allowed them inside. That night, the grand living room of Blackwood Manor filled with voices. Not whispers. Not threats. Voices of people who had come because one woman refused to run. Grace laid every document across the long dining table. The journals. The property records. The sealed letters. The photographs. She told them everything. About the hidden door. The room beneath the mansion. The river chamber. The fortune. The baby blanket. And the message left behind by people who believed their family might survive only if someone, someday, had the courage to uncover the truth. For hours, the investigators examined every page. By sunrise, they had enough evidence to freeze dozens of fraudulent property claims across the county. Weeks later, 3 powerful men were arrested. Families who had lost farms, homes, and businesses were finally given the chance to reclaim what had been taken from them. But Grace did something no one expected. She could have kept the fortune. Legally, much of it belonged to her. She could have repaired the mansion, closed the gates, and lived the rest of her life without worrying about money again. Instead, she opened the doors. With Jillian's help, Grace created the Holloway House Foundation. Its purpose was simple: to offer shelter to women who had nowhere else to go. Women leaving broken marriages. Women carrying children with no family beside them. Women who had been told they were too weak, too old, too damaged, or too late to begin again. The East Wing became bedrooms. The library became a classroom. The greenhouse was rebuilt into a place where herbs, flowers, and vegetables grew beneath warm glass. The hidden fortune paid for legal support, medical care, job training, and safe housing. No woman who crossed the threshold was asked to explain why she had stayed too long, or why she had finally left. They were simply told, "You are safe now." Months passed. Blackwood Manor changed. Where silence had once filled the corridors, children laughed. Where dust once covered the windows, morning sunlight poured across polished floors. The rooms no longer carried the weight of secrets. They carried hope, and Grace changed with them. She no longer avoided mirrors. She no longer lowered her eyes when people called her strong. She understood now that strength did not mean never breaking. It meant gathering the broken pieces, and using them to build something that could shelter someone else. Her daughter arrived on a stormy spring morning. The rain struck the windows almost exactly as it had on the night the black SUV returned. But this time, Grace wasn't afraid. Women filled the hallway outside her bedroom. Some prayed. Some cried. Some held hands. Walter waited downstairs with flowers from the restored greenhouse. Jillian paced near the fireplace, pretending not to be nervous. After hours of labor, a newborn cry rose through the mansion. Clear. Strong. Alive. Grace held the tiny child against her chest and wept. Not from pain, not from grief, but because, for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to arrive somewhere and know you belonged. She named her daughter Hope Margaret Holloway. Chucks. Hope for the future. Margaret for the woman whose hidden letter had survived long enough to guide them home. That evening, Grace carried the baby to the front window. Outside, the old iron gates stood open. Beyond them, the first flowers of spring pushed through the earth. Women walked through the garden with their children. Laughter drifted beneath the trees. The mansion no longer looked haunted. It looked alive. Grace pressed her lips gently against her daughter's forehead. One day, she whispered, people may tell you this house was cursed. She smiled through her tears. But the truth is, this house was waiting for someone to turn its pain into purpose. Years later, people would no longer remember Blackwood Manor as the home of a feared and powerful man. They would remember it as the place where hundreds of women found safety, where children slept without fear, where lives began again. And whenever someone asked Grace how she had found the courage to stay when everything told her to run, she always gave the same answer. I didn't save that house. She would look toward the open windows, the restored gardens, and the people whose lives had filled its empty rooms. That house showed me I was still worth saving. Grace had entered Blackwood Manor believing she had lost everything. Her marriage, her home, her future. But sometimes, life doesn't take everything away to punish us. Sometimes it clears the road ahead, so we can finally see where we were meant to go. And sometimes, the place everyone else is afraid to enter becomes the place where broken hearts learn how to live again. Some people believe that strength means never falling, but life has a way of teaching us something very different. Real strength isn't found in the moments when everything is going your way. It's found in the quiet moments when your heart is broken, your future feels uncertain, and every voice around you tells you to give up. Yet you choose to take one more step. Grace Holloway never set out to become a hero. She wasn't searching for hidden treasure. She wasn't chasing a family fortune. She was simply looking for one small place where she and her daughter could begin again. What she discovered was far greater than gold or old family secrets. She discovered that our greatest inheritance is not money. It is courage. It is kindness. It is the choice to turn our deepest pain into hope for someone else. Every scar we carry has the power to become a bridge for another person who is still struggling to cross. Sometimes the chapters we wish had never happened become the very chapters that prepare us to change someone else's life. Maybe today you're standing at your own front door, wondering if you have enough strength to keep going. Maybe you've lost someone you loved. Maybe you've watched your dreams fall apart. Or maybe you're simply tired. If that's you, remember grace. Remember that the darkest houses sometimes hide the brightest futures. And remember that a new beginning rarely looks beautiful when it first arrives. Sometimes, it looks like an old key, a broken house, or one last chance that everyone else is afraid to take, because the life you've been praying for may already be waiting. Just on the other side of the door you're afraid to open. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments. What would you have done if you were standing in Grace's place? Would you have stayed or walked away? If you enjoyed this journey of hope, resilience, and second chances, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next heartfelt story. Every week, we share powerful stories about ordinary people who discover extraordinary courage, hidden hope, and life-changing second chances. And if you know someone who is rebuilding their life after loss, heartbreak, or disappointment, share this story with them. Sometimes one story, one person, one act of kindness is enough to remind someone that it's never too late to begin again. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.